Hi everyone, so this is my follow-up video to Augustan and neoclassical poetry. I'm going to be talking today about the prose that saw the light of day in the neoclassical age. So contrary to the drama and poetry that was produced, the novel was quite free by comparison, formally speaking. It was much looser, much baggier, and this period saw the rise of the novel, especially the period from 1720 to 1790. That saw a prodigious rise in the production of novels. Right? They were generally published in magazines, in installments, and authors were paid by the page, which is why some of the books were this thick or worse. Now it's this period that saw the rise of the novel also saw the rise of the middle class, and so much greater readership in the middle class. So the two are probably linked at a deep level. Now, before this period, you had things like The Pilgrim's Progress, right? John Bunyan's novel was based on kind of a religious narrative, a deeply religious allegory. So that, by some critics, that's seen as the first novel. Others argue that the first novel is Robinson Crusoe, because even though it does have a religious story arc, it's very much man in a setting that is not uniquely religious. It's not just a religious allegory. And if you read this as a child, you probably didn't even notice there was a religious element. But it is still very much a confession of falling from grace. And Robinson Crusoe's thoughts are mostly bent on not just building a little house, but how he is seen in God's eyes and how he can slowly redeem himself and gain salvation once again. He tends to see his exile on the island, the fact that he's marooned on the island, as a religious punishment. Right? So you still have this very 17th century allegorical feel, but it's not entirely allegorical, as I say. The characters do not have allegorical names the way they do in John Bunyan's story. And you have this feeling of free will, and that not absolutely everything can be explained by reference to God and religion. You also see that Robinson Crusoe is a kind of I hesitate to say allegory, but that he is a kind of stand-in for capitalism, right? That he is a sort of homo economicus. He manages his island just as a capitalist would. He makes Man Friday work for him, etc. Right? So there is this kind of he is the kind of proto-capitalist who makes everything work and manages to get a whole company going. Right? The island being his company. Right, so you have a kind of justification for imperialism as well, right? He uses Man Friday, more or less as a slave to begin with, and then as a companion, right? So this is the major novel. As I say, most critics feel that this is the first sort of layman's novel, even though it does have strong religious connotations in it. And so this interest in the ordinary life, in ordinary everyday occurrences, even though it's set on an island, is what critics feel is the start of the novel. This interest in the everyday, the mundane, right, the ordinary. This also started a craze for what's called Robinsonades, novels based on adventures at sea, adventures of every kind, not just at sea. And you have this figure of the traveler, who is sometimes a rogue, a picaro in the Spanish tradition, a kind of rogue who gets by, on the strength of his wits. And so adventure stories of this kind for adults became extremely popular throughout the 18th century. So this is published, as I say, in 1719. Now, you have another major novel that you all know as well, which is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Now, Gulliver's Travels is a kind of parody of Robinson Crusoe, in that it makes fun of all this realism that Robinson Crusoe emphasizes so much, even though Robinson Crusoe isn't entirely realistic, in that when he spends 26 years on his own on the island, or a good part of those 26 years alone without Man Friday, he can still speak perfectly, and his mind hasn't deteriorated in any way, which isn't quite realistic. But still, Robinson Crusoe is seen as a kind of blueprint for the realist novel. It did set a precedent for realism, whereas Gulliver's Travels breaks away from realism. The only real country that is visited by Gulliver is Japan towards the end of the novel. Right, so you have this interest in the marvelous, and you could make a case for the idea that the novel really started off with unrealistic elements, and that it was always more of a fantastical genre, and that realism really is just a kind of bracket within that greater form of the fantastic novel. So we tend to see the realist novel as the mainstream, which it is today. But if you place that in a historical context, you really find that there are far more periods that wrote novels in which there are magical occurrences. So this had a major influence as well. It was instantly regarded as a classic. Now, a third novel I'll mention is Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Now, Tom Jones is this very ordinary man, and all sorts of things happen to him. All sorts of fortunes and misfortunes. You see the rise and fall of his fortunes, and he's a very ordinary sort of man. You find out at the end that he isn't quite as ordinary as you thought in terms of social status, but there is a strong emphasis on the trials and tribulations of ordinary people. Right? That was one of the great emphases of the realist novel, an interest in ordinary folk and also the working class. You see this also in Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders. Moll Flanders is a prostitute, and so this was quite shocking for the day, to take an interest. It was quite novel. Defoe didn't have this feeling that he was creating a new genre. It just kind of, evolved from existing prose. And it's only gradually in the 18th century that the novel was recognized as a separate genre. before it was just, seen as prose. Or as this novel is a kind of epic in prose. He called it a comic epic in prose. So you see, in terms of genre, there was still a strong reference to the most important genres. The neoclassical age was very much into a hierarchy in the genre, in the groups of genres. So there were what they call these kinds of literature. So at the top of the hierarchy you had the epic, that was seen as the most prestigious genre, and the novel wasn't seen as prestigious at all. It was seen as rather popular and unrefined, because it was so loose in its form. You could introduce more or less anything you wanted in a novel. Right. So there is, of course, Samuel Richardson, who wrote later on with, and he's introduced the sentimental novel, and so that it was during the age of sentiment, which overlaps with the age of Johnson. So the novel as a whole tended to be realistic, and it sort of paved the way for the 19th century high realism that refined the realism that was developed in these prose works during the 18th century. Okay, see you in the next video on drama in the neoclassical age. Bye.